The moment people begin treating you better after hearing about your will, they are no longer loving you. They are negotiating with your future. I wish someone had told me that before I walked into my attorney's office on a quiet Tuesday morning. My name is Evelyn Brooks. I am 72 years old, a widow, and for the first time since my husband Thomas passed away 8 years earlier, I finally felt emotionally ready to organize the last legal details of my life. There was nothing dramatic about the appointment. Richard Lawson, our family attorney for nearly 3 decades, welcomed me with the same warm smile he had offered every time Thomas and I sat across from his polished oak desk. We reviewed documents carefully, discussed charitable donations, confirmed personal wishes, and made sure every decision reflected my own values rather than anyone else's expectations. When I signed the final page, Richard closed the folder gently before looking at me with quiet reassurance. He reminded me that a will was never truly about money. It was about leaving behind clarity, preventing unnecessary conflict, and protecting the people I loved from difficult decisions later. As I drove home through familiar tree-lined streets, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time since losing Thomas, I believed I had fulfilled one more promise we had quietly made to each other. Life could continue without unanswered questions waiting in the background. I never mentioned the details of my appointment to anyone. I simply told my son Daniel during our weekly telephone call that I had spent the afternoon meeting with Richard to update some legal paperwork. Daniel barely reacted. He wished me a good evening before rushing back to work. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. I thought nothing of it until 3 days later, when my daughter-in-law Melissa unexpectedly appeared at my front door carrying a basket filled with fresh blueberry muffins, homemade chicken soup, and a bouquet of white lilies. She wrapped her arms around me before I even had the chance to invite her inside. I realized we have not spent nearly enough time together, she said with a bright smile. That seemed almost too perfect. I was pleasantly surprised. Melissa had always been polite, but our relationship had never been especially close. She and Daniel both worked demanding jobs, and life often became too busy for long visits. Naturally, I welcomed her inside. We spent the afternoon drinking tea in my sunroom while she asked about my favorite books, my gardening projects, and stories about Thomas that she had never shown much interest in before. I found myself enjoying the conversation more than I expected. Before leaving, she insisted on organizing my pantry because she said I should not have to do everything by myself anymore. The following morning, she telephoned simply to ask whether I had slept well. The next afternoon, she invited me to dinner. 2 days later, she dropped off fresh flowers again because she had seen them at the grocery store and thought of me. Every gesture was thoughtful. Every word sounded kind. Every smile seemed sincere. Yet something deep inside me felt quietly unsettled. It was not because Melissa had suddenly become generous. It was because nothing else in our lives had changed except one simple fact. Somehow, shortly after I mentioned visiting my attorney, the woman who had always been pleasantly distant had transformed into the sweetest person I had ever met. Sitting alone in my living room that evening, I looked at the fresh flowers resting on the coffee table and found myself wondering whether kindness that arrives without warning is always a blessing, or whether sometimes it is the beginning of a question that deserves to be answered. Over the following 2 weeks, Melissa's kindness did not fade the way unexpected enthusiasm usually does. Instead, it became part of my everyday routine. Nearly every morning began with a cheerful text message asking how I had slept. If the weather turned chilly, she appeared with homemade soup. If she visited the farmer's market, she arrived carrying fresh fruit because she insisted I deserved the very best. On Saturday afternoons, she volunteered to help weed my flower beds, even though she had never shown much interest in gardening before. More than once I caught myself smiling as I watched her carefully trim the rose bushes Thomas had planted years ago. I wanted to believe this new closeness was genuine. After all, every family hopes relationships improve with time. Yet the more generous Melissa became, the more frequently our conversations drifted toward subjects that had never interested her before. While we folded towels together one afternoon, she casually admired the old house. She commented on how beautiful the hardwood floors were and wondered aloud how difficult it must be to maintain such a large property alone. I simply smiled and told her the house held too many memories for me to think about leaving. She nodded warmly before changing the subject. A few days later, she complimented Thomas for having been such a careful planner. Then she asked whether organizing legal paperwork had brought me peace of mind. The question sounded innocent enough, and I answered honestly that it had. She did not ask what was written in the documents, but I noticed her watching my expression carefully before smiling again. During another visit, she mentioned how complicated estates could become if families were not prepared. She laughed softly and said she had watched several friends struggle after losing elderly relatives because no one knew where important papers had been kept. Once again, her words sounded practical rather than intrusive. Even so, I quietly noticed a pattern forming. Different conversations always seemed to circle back to the same destination. My house, my finances, my future plans, my legal paperwork. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Daniel joined us for dinner after work. Melissa had prepared my favorite chicken pot pie and insisted I sit down while she served everyone. As we ate, Daniel mentioned that business had been unusually stressful. Melissa immediately placed her hand gently on his shoulder before turning toward me with another thoughtful smile. Family is what matters most, she said. That is why it is important to plan ahead and make everything as easy as possible for the people you love. Daniel nodded absent-mindedly, apparently unaware of how familiar that subject had become. I simply took another sip of tea without answering. Later that evening, after they had driven home, I walked through the quiet rooms of my house, turning off lamps one by one. Thomas's favorite reading chair still sat beside the fireplace exactly where he had left it years ago. Family photographs lined the hallway, each one preserving moments that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love. Standing there in the silence, I realized something that unsettled me more than Melissa's sudden kindness itself. She had not asked me once about my health, my loneliness, or the hobbies I enjoyed since becoming a widow without eventually guiding the conversation toward what would happen someday after I was gone. Every question arrived wrapped in warmth, yet each one seemed to lead gently toward the same invisible destination. For the first time, I began wondering whether I was witnessing genuine affection growing naturally, or a carefully practiced performance that simply happened to begin immediately after one ordinary visit to my attorney's office. As the days turned into weeks, Melissa's attention became even more difficult to understand. She anticipated needs I had never mentioned, remembered small details from conversations years earlier, and somehow always seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment. One afternoon, she appeared with a new bird feeder because she remembered Thomas had loved watching cardinals from the kitchen window. Another morning, she surprised me by replacing the worn cushions on my porch swing without asking. Every thoughtful gesture was accompanied by the same warm smile and the same reassuring words. You deserve to let someone take care of you for a change. I appreciated her kindness more than I could easily admit, yet something continued pulling gently at the back of my mind. It was not the generosity itself that unsettled me. It was the feeling that every act of kindness was carefully arranged, almost as though each one belonged to a larger picture I could not yet fully see. One Saturday afternoon, Melissa offered to help organize the filing cabinet in my home office. She explained that important papers could become difficult to locate during emergencies and insisted that having everything neatly labeled would make life easier for everyone. At first, the suggestion sounded perfectly reasonable. Together, we sorted old utility bills, insurance records, tax returns, and decades of family photographs tucked inside forgotten folders. As she carefully placed documents into new file organizers, I noticed her eyes pause briefly whenever she came across anything related to the house, bank statements, or legal correspondence. She never opened anything private, and she never crossed a clear boundary, but her curiosity lingered just long enough for me to notice. Later, while we shared iced tea on the back porch, she smiled casually and asked whether Richard Lawson had recommended updating all of my estate paperwork or only part of it. I answered politely that everything important had already been taken care of and left the conversation there. She nodded with obvious satisfaction before changing the subject to Emma's upcoming school activities. The transition happened so smoothly that someone else might never have questioned it. I did. A few evenings later, Daniel telephoned simply to check on me. We talked about work, the weather, and Emma's plans to visit colleges the following year. Before ending the call, he laughed softly and mentioned that Melissa had become determined to spend more time with family lately because she believed life was too short to postpone meaningful relationships. His voice carried genuine appreciation for his wife's new attitude. Listening to him, I realized he truly believed her recent transformation had happened naturally. That realization made me unexpectedly sad because if I questioned Melissa's motives too quickly, I risked appearing suspicious of kindness itself. Yet ignoring my instincts had never served me well during 40 years of marriage or decades of raising a family. Thomas often reminded me that patterns reveal more than promises. Sitting alone after the call ended, I opened an old photo album from our earliest years together. There were photographs of birthdays celebrated around the same dining table where our family still gathered, vacations taken in a station wagon that no longer existed, and Christmas mornings filled with laughter long before anyone worried about inheritances or legal documents. Looking through those memories reminded me that genuine love had always required very little performance. It showed itself consistently through ordinary days rather than suddenly appearing all at once. As I closed the album and switched off the living room lamp, I quietly promised myself that I would stop judging Melissa by the gifts she brought or the compliments she offered. Instead, I would begin paying closer attention to the direction every conversation seemed to travel. If my instincts were wrong, I would happily admit it. But if they were right, the truth would eventually reveal itself without me forcing it. Because people can rehearse words for only so long before their real intentions begin speaking on their own. The following week, I scheduled another appointment with Richard Lawson, telling no one except my neighbor that I would be out for the afternoon. I had not gone there because I wanted to change my will. I went because I wanted to change my understanding of everything that had happened during the previous month. Richard greeted me warmly and immediately noticed that something seemed to be weighing on my mind. After we exchanged a few pleasantries, I quietly described the sudden transformation in Melissa's behavior. I told him about the flowers, the homemade meals, the unexpected visits, the thoughtful gifts, and the conversations that somehow always drifted back toward my house, my future, and my legal paperwork. Richard listened without interrupting, folding his hands together once I had finished speaking. After a long moment of silence, he smiled gently before saying something Thomas himself might have said years earlier. "Evelyn," he began, "a good will reflects your values, not other people's expectations. Never change it because someone pressures you, and never refuse to change it simply because you feel guilty. It should always represent what you truly believe." I nodded quietly, feeling more relieved than I expected. Richard was not telling me to distrust my family. He was reminding me to trust my own judgment. Before I left, he added one more piece of advice that stayed with me during the drive home. "Do not rush to conclusions based on words alone," he said. "Observe patterns. Consistency always reveals character better than promises." Those words echoed in my thoughts over the following days. Instead of questioning Melissa directly, I simply watched. I noticed that she rarely asked how I was feeling without eventually mentioning what would happen if maintaining the house became difficult someday. She complimented my independence while gently suggesting that letting family help manage certain responsibilities might reduce my stress. She offered to organize important documents again, saying it would save everyone confusion in the future. Every suggestion sounded practical. Every conversation remained warm and respectful. Yet every road still seemed to lead toward the same destination. One Saturday afternoon, Melissa invited me to lunch at a charming cafe near the river. The meal itself was delightful. We laughed about Emma's school memories, shared stories about Thomas, and admired families walking along the waterfront. Just as I began thinking perhaps I had worried unnecessarily, Melissa smiled warmly across the table and reached for my hand. "You have always been so organized," she said. "I hope Daniel never has to struggle with difficult decisions if something unexpected ever happens." Her voice remained gentle. Her expression remained affectionate. Yet once again the conversation quietly returned to planning for a future where I was no longer present. I squeezed her hand kindly before changing the subject to Emma's upcoming birthday. Melissa followed my lead without hesitation, but I noticed a brief flicker of disappointment disappear almost as quickly as it appeared. Driving home that afternoon, I found myself remembering something Thomas often said after long days at work. "The truth usually whispers before it speaks." I realized I did not need proof that Melissa had bad intentions. I also did not need to accuse her of anything unfair. All I needed was patience. If her kindness came from genuine love, time would strengthen it naturally. If it came from expectation, time would eventually expose the difference. As I placed my house keys on the kitchen counter and looked around the home Thomas and I had built together, I quietly decided that from that day forward, I would listen less carefully to compliments and much more carefully to consistency. Because the greatest test of someone's heart is not how they treat you after learning what you own, but whether they would still choose the very same kindness if they believed you had nothing left to give. For nearly another month, I said very little about the quiet doubts growing inside me. Instead, I continued living exactly as I always had, allowing life to unfold while paying closer attention than ever before. Melissa never stopped being thoughtful. Fresh flowers still appeared on my porch almost every week. Homemade casseroles continued arriving on Sunday afternoons. She called simply to ask whether I had eaten lunch or whether the weather had been kind enough for me to enjoy my garden. Anyone looking from the outside would have said I was incredibly fortunate to have such a caring daughter-in-law. A part of me wanted desperately to believe they were right. Then one Wednesday afternoon, something happened that I never could have planned. I stopped at a small garden center across town to buy tomato plants and several bags of potting soil. While waiting for an employee to load everything into my car, I noticed Melissa sitting with two women at the outdoor cafe next door. They were laughing together, completely unaware that I was only a short distance away behind a display of flowering hydrangeas. I had no intention of listening. In fact, I turned my shopping cart toward the parking lot. Then I heard one of the women mention my name. Instinctively, I paused. One friend smiled and said, "You and Evelyn seem so much closer these days." Melissa laughed softly before answering. I realized I should have made more of an effort years ago. The woman nodded and replied, "Well, it certainly does not hurt to stay close to family, especially later in life." Melissa stirred her coffee for a moment before saying, almost absent-mindedly, "No, it does not. Besides, you never know what the future looks like. It is better when everyone feels connected before important decisions have to be made." The conversation moved on immediately. They began talking about vacations, school schedules, and grocery prices. Nothing else sounded suspicious. Yet those few quiet sentences stayed with me long after I walked away. Perhaps Melissa had meant nothing by them. Perhaps she was only talking about families growing closer as parents became older. But her words fit too perfectly with everything I had been noticing for weeks. Every thoughtful visit, every conversation that gently drifted toward my future, every carefully timed question about planning ahead. Standing beside my car, I realized I no longer needed one dramatic piece of evidence. Real life rarely offers that. Instead, it reveals itself through dozens of small moments that all seem to point in the same direction. During the drive home, I replayed the conversation again and again, searching for another explanation that would allow me to dismiss my concerns. I wanted to believe I was simply becoming overly cautious after losing Thomas. I wanted to believe Melissa's kindness had arrived because she truly wanted a better relationship with me. But deep inside, another voice quietly reminded me that genuine affection usually grows slowly over time. It rarely appears overnight, immediately after someone learns you have visited an attorney. That evening, Daniel called to invite me to dinner the following weekend. His voice sounded warm and completely unaware that anything had changed. I accepted with genuine affection because none of this was his fault. After we ended the call, I walked into my study and looked at the folder containing my estate planning documents. I never opened it. I simply rested my hand on the cover for a long moment before closing the drawer once again. Richard had been right. Character does not reveal itself through one careless sentence. It reveals itself through patterns that become impossible to ignore. And for the first time since all of this had begun, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. Instead, I began wondering what I should do if my instincts turned out to be completely right. The morning after overhearing Melissa's conversation, I telephoned Richard Lawson and asked whether he had time to see me again. He told me to come by that afternoon, and when I arrived, he greeted me with the same calm professionalism that had always made difficult decisions feel manageable. I explained everything exactly as it had happened. I repeated Melissa's words as accurately as I could remember them and admitted that I was struggling to separate disappointment from good judgment. Richard listened carefully before speaking. "Evelyn," he said gently, "never make an important decision simply to reward someone or punish someone. Make it because it reflects your principles." His advice settled my thoughts almost immediately. I realized I did not want revenge. I wanted clarity. Together we reviewed my estate plan once again. Rather than focusing on individual possessions, Richard encouraged me to think about the legacy I hoped to leave behind. As I considered everything Thomas and I had built together, one idea became surprisingly clear. We had always believed that generosity should encourage character rather than entitlement. Before leaving the office, I asked Richard to prepare several revisions. Some charitable gifts that Thomas and I had discussed years earlier would now become permanent parts of the plan. I also decided to write a personal letter explaining every major decision in my own words, so no one would have to guess why I had made those choices. Richard smiled with quiet approval. That letter may become more valuable than the will itself, he said. Driving home, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing ever since Melissa's sudden transformation began. I had not acted from anger. I had acted from conviction. Over the following week, I behaved exactly as I always had. I welcomed Melissa into my home, thanked her for every thoughtful gesture, and continued enjoying time with Daniel and Emma. I did not confront anyone. There was no argument because I still hoped that perhaps, somewhere beneath her misplaced priorities, Melissa possessed the capacity to reflect honestly on her own choices. The following Sunday, while everyone gathered around my dining table after lunch, Daniel mentioned how quickly the season seemed to pass. That simple observation gave me the opportunity one had been quietly waiting for. Smiling warmly, I told the family that meeting with Richard had reminded me how important it was to keep legal documents updated as life changed. Melissa looked up immediately, though her expression remained pleasantly composed. I continued speaking in the same relaxed tone, explaining that after much thought, I had recently made several additional revisions to my estate plan. The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel nodded casually, apparently seeing nothing unusual in what I had said. Emma continued eating dessert without paying much attention. Melissa, however, seemed unusually interested. She asked whether updating everything had been difficult and whether I now felt relieved knowing it was all finished. I smiled and answered truthfully. Yes, I said. I finally feel completely at peace with every decision. That answer appeared to satisfy her, although I noticed the brief look of relief that crossed her face before she quickly returned to her cheerful smile. Watching that single, unguarded moment confirmed everything my instincts had been trying to tell me for weeks. Genuine love celebrates another person's peace because they have found comfort. Conditional affection celebrates because expectations appear closer to becoming reality. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I placed the sealed letter Richard had helped me prepare inside my desk drawer beside the updated estate documents. Looking at both envelopes together, I realized they represented far more than legal paperwork. They represented the difference between leaving behind possessions and leaving behind principles. Whatever happened next, I knew my final decisions would reflect the values Thomas and I had spent a lifetime building together, and no amount of carefully timed kindness would ever persuade me to forget the difference between sincere affection and carefully calculated attention. Several weeks passed after I updated my estate plan, and I noticed something that confirmed my decision more clearly than any conversation ever could. Melissa's kindness continued, but it had slowly become more deliberate, almost as though she were trying to maintain an image she believed was expected of her. Every visit felt carefully prepared. Every compliment arrived at exactly the right moment. Every thoughtful gesture seemed polished until one Sunday afternoon when I finally decided it was time to gather the family together for a conversation that had nothing to do with legal documents and everything to do with legacy. I invited Daniel, Melissa, and Emma to my home for dinner the following weekend, explaining only that I wanted to share something important with the people I loved most. Everyone accepted without hesitation. Melissa even volunteered to prepare dessert, arriving with her usual warm smile and a homemade apple pie that filled the kitchen with the comforting scent of cinnamon. We enjoyed a pleasant meal together, laughing about Emma's school activities and reminiscing about old family vacations Thomas had carefully planned years ago. Watching everyone around the table reminded me how much I wanted this family to remain united long after I was gone. When dinner ended, I gently placed my coffee cup on the table and asked whether everyone would stay seated for a few more minutes. The atmosphere immediately became quieter. Daniel looked curious. Emma folded her hands politely. Melissa smiled encouragingly, although I noticed a hint of nervous anticipation in her expression. I reached into the drawer beside the dining table and removed a sealed envelope. "This is not my will," I said calmly before anyone could assume otherwise. "It is simply a letter I wrote after spending many hours thinking about what I hoped to leave behind." I slowly opened the envelope and began reading. I wrote about Thomas and the values that had guided our marriage through nearly 50 years together. I described how honesty had always mattered more than comfort, how kindness only carried meaning when it expected nothing in return, and how true generosity could never be measured only by money. As I continued reading, the room grew completely silent. I explained that inheritances should never become rewards for performance, but reflections of trust, gratitude, and character developed over many years. Finally, I looked directly at Daniel and Melissa before speaking without anger or accusation. "During the past several months," I said gently, "I have experienced more attention than I received during many years before that." Part of me felt grateful. Another part quietly wondered why that change happened only after I mentioned updating legal paperwork. Melissa's smile faded almost instantly. Daniel slowly turned toward her before looking back at me. I raised my hand softly, asking them not to interrupt. "I am not interested in arguing," I continued. "I only want everyone to understand one simple truth. I have updated my estate plan according to my conscience, and every decision reflects the values your father and I shared throughout our lives. Nothing more and nothing less." No one spoke for several long moments. Emma quietly looked down at the table, sensing the weight of the conversation without fully understanding it. Melissa lowered her eyes, her confident composure gradually giving way to visible discomfort. I felt no satisfaction watching that change. Instead, I felt sadness because I realized how easily the promise of future possessions can quietly reshape present relationships. Looking around the table at the people I loved, I silently hoped this conversation would become the beginning of greater honesty rather than the end of our closeness, because the greatest inheritance any family can receive is the courage to value one another while everyone is still sitting together around the same table. The silence that followed my letter seemed to stretch far beyond the walls of the dining room. No one reached for a coffee cup. No one looked toward the television humming quietly in the next room. Even Emma, who usually filled every silence with cheerful conversation, remained perfectly still. Daniel was the first to speak. His voice was calm, but I could hear the confusion beneath it. "Mom," he asked carefully, "are you saying you believe Melissa has been pretending all this time?" I looked at my son before answering. "I am saying that I noticed a change," I replied gently. "I noticed when it began. I noticed what our conversations slowly became about. And I noticed that every road somehow seemed to lead back to my future rather than my present." Melissa immediately shook her head. "That is not fair," she said quietly. "I really did want us to become closer." There was no anger in her voice, only hurt and uncertainty. "Then I am grateful for every genuine moment we shared," I answered. "But you have to understand why I struggled to separate sincere affection from carefully timed attention." Daniel turned toward his wife, searching her face for reassurance. "Melissa, tell me she is wrong." Melissa opened her mouth to answer, but stopped. She looked down at her folded hands, then toward the family photographs hanging on the dining room wall. Nearly a full minute passed before she spoke again. "I wish I could," she whispered. Another long silence settled over the room. Finally, she drew a slow breath and continued. "When Daniel mentioned that you had met with Richard, I started thinking about the future. At first, I told myself I simply wanted to make up for all the years we had been too busy to spend together. I honestly believed that was true." She paused again, struggling to continue. "But somewhere along the way, I also started wondering what life might look like after you were gone. I never sat down and made a plan. I never told myself to manipulate you. It happened little by little. Every time I chose to visit, every time I brought flowers or dinner, I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. Looking back now, I cannot honestly say my reasons stayed pure." Daniel stared at her in stunned silence. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked softly. Tears filled Melissa's eyes. "Because I did not even admit it to myself," she answered. "The more kind I became, the easier it was to believe my intentions had become kind too. I kept telling myself that if I became the daughter-in-law you deserved, then my reasons for starting would not matter anymore." Listening to her, I felt my disappointment begin giving way to something quieter. Not relief, not satisfaction, understanding. Human beings rarely wake up one morning, deciding to become selfish. More often, they take one small step in the wrong direction and spend months convincing themselves they are still walking the right path. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over Melissa's. She looked at me with tear-filled eyes. "Melissa," I said softly, "I never wanted perfection from you. I only wanted to know that when you knocked on my front door, you were coming to see me rather than what you imagined I might someday leave behind." She nodded slowly as tears slipped down her cheeks. Daniel quietly took her other hand without saying a word. Emma watched all of us with thoughtful eyes, witnessing a lesson about honesty that no classroom could ever teach. Looking around the table, I realized families are not broken by one mistake. They are broken when people become too proud to admit the mistake ever happened. And in that quiet dining room, for the very first time in months, I believed our family had finally stopped pretending and started telling one another the truth. The weeks that followed our conversation did not transform everything overnight, and perhaps that was the greatest sign that real change had finally begun. Genuine trust is not rebuilt through dramatic promises. It returns quietly, one honest decision at a time. Melissa stopped arriving unexpectedly with extravagant gifts and carefully planned surprises. Instead, she began visiting simply to share an afternoon together. Sometimes we drank tea on the porch while watching birds gather around the feeder Thomas had once installed. Other days we baked Emma's favorite oatmeal cookies or worked together in the flower garden without discussing the future, legal papers, or anything that might someday belong to someone else. For the first time since all of this had begun, our conversations felt wonderfully ordinary. Daniel also changed in ways that were easy to overlook unless you knew what life had been like before. Whenever he called, his first question was no longer about practical matters or family schedules. Instead, he asked how I was feeling, what book I was reading, or whether the roses had started blooming yet. Those simple questions reminded me that genuine attention cannot be measured by how often someone visits, but by whether they truly see the person sitting in front of them. One afternoon, Emma stopped by after school carrying a history assignment about family traditions. She asked whether I believed money was the most important thing parents could leave their children. I smiled and invited her to sit beside me on the porch swing. Looking out across the backyard where Thomas had spent so many peaceful evenings, I answered carefully. "Money can solve certain problems," I said softly. "But character teaches people how to live once the money is gone. That is why values will always outlast valuables." Emma wrote those words in her notebook before smiling thoughtfully. Several days later, Richard Lawson telephoned to let me know that every revision to my estate plan had been completed exactly as I requested. I thanked him warmly before placing the receiver back on its cradle. Strangely, I felt no excitement about the documents themselves. Instead, I felt grateful that I no longer thought about them very often. They had become exactly what legal paperwork should be, something prepared carefully and then quietly set aside while life continued. One Sunday evening, our entire family gathered again around the same dining table where difficult truths had once filled the room with silence. This time the atmosphere felt entirely different. We laughed over old photographs, listened as Emma shared stories about school, and remembered Thomas with smiles instead of sadness. Before everyone left, Melissa lingered behind for a moment. She hugged me gently and said something I will never forget. "Thank you for giving me the chance to become the daughter-in-law I should have been before I ever thought about inheritance." I hugged her back without hesitation because forgiveness is not forgetting what happened. It is choosing not to let yesterday permanently decide tomorrow. As I watched my family drive away that evening, I looked around the home Thomas and I had built together over a lifetime of ordinary days filled with extraordinary love. I finally understood that my greatest legacy would never be listed inside a legal document. It would live inside the conversations we had shared, the lessons we had learned, and the courage we found to choose honesty over convenience. A will can distribute possessions, but it cannot distribute wisdom. That must be passed from one heart to another while there is still time to speak the words aloud. If this chapter of my life taught me anything, it is that kindness becomes truly beautiful only when it asks for nothing in return. And the richest inheritance any family can ever receive is the ability to love one another long before anyone begins wondering who will inherit the house. Thank you for listening and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, Please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.